Comic book fans in the early to mid 2000s were fortunate enough to be treated to a kind of superhero movie that felt completely different from what we'd eventually get. Before cinematic universes took over multiplexes, comic book films could be really weird. They could be gothic, they could be funny, they could be a little gross, and sometimes they could star a giant red demon who loved Baby Ruth candy bars and occasionally save the world. That movie was Hellboy, released in 2004, and more than 20 years later, it still feels like one of the most unique comic book films ever made. Today we're starting a short retrospective on the Del Toro Perlman era films based on the Dark Horse comic book created by Mike Mignola. The story begins during the final days of World War II. As the Allies close in on victory, the Nazis make one last desperate attempt to change history. Led by the sinister Grigory Rasputin, they perform an occult ritual on a remote Scottish island in hopes of opening a portal, unleashing cosmic horrors that will guarantee their victory. The ritual is interrupted by Allied forces led by Professor Trevor Bruttenholm, but not before one unexpected visitor slips through the portal. Instead of an army of monsters, a small red demon with a stone right hand arrives on Earth. Professor Bruttenholm, affectionately called Broom, chooses compassion over fear and raises the child as his own. Fast forward 60 years, and that little demon has grown into Hellboy, a paranormal investigator working for the BPRD, or the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Defense. His job involves hunting monsters, ghosts, and supernatural threats while trying to keep his existence hidden from the general public. Things become complicated when Rasputin returns from the dead and attempts to fulfill the prophecy that Hellboy was destined to bring about the end of the world. Hellboy has to choose between embracing the destiny written for him long before he was born, or deciding that the family who raised him matters more than fate itself. It's a surprisingly heartfelt story wrapped inside a monster movie. Ron Perlman is absolutely perfect as Hellboy. By 2004, he had already built a reputation for playing physically imposing but emotionally complex characters. Many viewers knew him from the television series Beauty and the Beast, where he played Vincent beneath elaborate makeup, and genre fans had seen him in films like The City of Lost Children and Alien Resurrection. Years later, he'd become familiar to an entirely new generation through Sons of Anarchy, proving once again that nobody delivers gravelly sarcasm quite like Ron Perlman. John Hurt plays Professor Bruttenholm, Hellboy's adoptive father. Hurt had one of the most respected careers in British cinema, appearing in films like The Elephant Man, Midnight Express, and perhaps most famously for science fiction fans, Alien, where he was involved in one of the most unforgettable dinner scenes in movie history. He brings warmth and dignity to Broom, making the father-son relationship the emotional anchor of the entire film. Selma Blair plays Liz Sherman, a woman cursed with uncontrollable pyrokinetic abilities. Blair was already well known from films like Cruel Intentions and Legally Blonde, and she gives Liz a vulnerability that keeps the character from becoming just another superhero love interest. Doug Jones performs Abe Sapien, the psychic amphibious investigator whose graceful movements make the character feel genuinely otherworldly. Jones has made an entire career out of portraying creatures beneath layers of makeup, later appearing in films like Pan's Labyrinth, Shape of Water, and the series Star Trek Discovery. Although the voice of Abe in this film was dubbed by David Hyde Pierce, Jones's physical performance is what gives the character much of his personality. Rounding out the cast are Rupert Evans as FBI agent John Myers, Jeffrey Tambor as the hilariously bureaucratic Tom Manning, and Karl Roden as the resurrected Rasputin, who somehow manages to make standing perfectly still feel threatening. To understand why Hellboy feels so different, you have to start with its director. Guillermo del Toro had already established himself as one of the most imaginative filmmakers working in fantasy and horror. His earlier films, including Kronos, Mimic, and The Devil's Backbone, demonstrated an incredible ability to make monsters sympathetic while making humans terrifying. Del Toro wasn't interested in monsters simply because they look cool. He loved them because they represented outsiders. And that made him an ideal choice for adapting Mike Mignola's comic. Mignola's artwork is incredibly distinctive. Heavy shadows, bold silhouettes, gothic architecture, ancient folklore mixed with pulp adventure. It's the sort of art style that immediately tells you whose comic you're reading. Rather than trying to reinvent the property, Del Toro embraced its personality and worked closely with Mignola throughout the production, preserving many of the comic's designs while expanding the world into something cinematic. Getting the film made wasn't exactly easy. Hollywood was not convinced that a comic book about a demon working for the government was going to become the next blockbuster. Superhero movies were becoming more successful thanks to films like X-Men and Spider-Man, but Hellboy wasn't exactly a household name. One major sticking point was casting. The studio reportedly questioned whether Ron Perlman was bankable enough to lead a major comic book movie. Del Toro, however, refused to make the film without him. According to numerous interviews over the years, Del Toro essentially treated Perlman as non-negotiable. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine anyone else. Perlman doesn't simply play Hellboy, he somehow disappears into several hours of makeup while making the character feel effortlessly human. Beneath the filed-down horns and oversized stone hand is basically a blue-collar guy who'd rather eat pancakes than fulfill ancient prophecies. The makeup itself deserves enormous credit. This was before digital de-aging, digital makeup replacements, and CGI enhancements became common. Hellboy required hours in the makeup chair every day, and nearly everything audiences see was accomplished with practical effects, prosthetics, and costumes. The result has aged remarkably well. Ironically, because so much of the movie is physical, it often looks more convincing than many effects-heavy superhero films released a decade later. Del Toro also filled the movie with practical creatures wherever possible. Samael, the monstrous hound that evolves every time it's injured, combines animatronics, prosthetics, performers in suits, and digital touch-ups. The blend gives it a tangible weight that purely digital monsters sometimes struggle to achieve. When the film arrived in April 2004, reviews were generally positive. Critics praised the visuals, Perlman's performance, and Del Toro's imagination, although some felt the plot followed familiar superhero conventions, which I think was probably a smart move since the characters and tone were already so out of the ordinary. Not a bad idea to ground some aspect of the story in the familiar. The film ended up earning a respectable worldwide box office, nearly $100 million, and performed strongly enough to justify a sequel, but perhaps its greatest success came later, through DVD sales, cable television, and home video. Like so many genre films from the early 2000s, Hellboy slowly evolved into a cult classic, which is probably where a movie like this belongs. It rewards repeat viewings because the production design is packed with tiny details. Ancient artifacts line the walls, every monster has its own history, even background props feel like they belong to a much larger universe that continues existing long after the credits roll. One of the reasons the movie remains so enjoyable is its tone. It never tries to convince you that superheroes are above all the bullshit that the rest of us have to deal with day to day. Hellboy complains about his job, he gets annoyed, he has relationship problems, he argues with his father, he occasionally solves supernatural problems by punching them really hard. It's refreshing because the film never forgets that comic books are allowed to be fun. At the same time, it avoids becoming a parody. Underneath all the monster fights is a story about identity. Hellboy spends the entire movie being judged for what he looks like rather than who he chooses to become. Everyone assumes destiny is unavoidable. Rasputin insists Hellboy was born for destruction. Others fear him simply because he is a demon. Even ordinary civilians panic whenever they catch a glimpse of him. The only people who truly know him are the family who raised him. That's the central message of the film. You weren't defined by where you came from. You're defined by the choices you make. That's a timeless idea, and it's probably why the movie resonates just as much today. The relationship between Hellboy and Professor Bruttenholm is especially effective because it feels believable. They're not simply mentor-student, they're father and son. When Broom worries about Hellboy, it isn't just because of prophecy, it's because he's his dad. That emotional grounding keeps the fantasy from floating away into spectacle. And then there's Abe Sapien. Doug Jones somehow communicates intelligence, curiosity, kindness, and occasional awkwardness, almost entirely through body language. It's one of those performances that becomes more impressive every time you watch it because none of it feels exaggerated. Jeffrey Tambor deserves some appreciation too. Tom Manning could have been written as a one-note government bureaucrat, but Tambor finds just enough humanity beneath all of the paperwork to make him entertaining instead of irritating. Visually, Hellboy is unmistakably a Guillermo del Toro film. The sets are filled with gears, old books, rusted machinery, religious iconography, strange laboratories, forgotten tunnels, and creatures that somehow manage to be both beautiful and disgusting at the same time. That's actually one of Del Toro's greatest strengths. He doesn't design monsters simply to scare audiences. He designs them to spark curiosity. You want to know where they came from, what myths inspired them, what stories exist beyond the edge of the frame. Watching Hellboy today is like taking a step back into a different era of comic book filmmaking. There was room for smaller scale stories. There wasn't an expectation that every movie needed to tease 6 sequels, 3 streaming series, and 17 post-credit scenes. If a film told you a satisfying story and left you wanting another adventure, that was enough. Unfortunately, we did get another adventure. Hellboy 2: The Golden Army arrived in 2008 and expanded the mythology even further, with many fans considering it one of Guillermo del Toro's finest films. After that, the series took a different direction with later reboots, but for many viewers, Ron Perlman's version remains the definitive live-action Hellboy. Part of that comes down to casting. Part of it comes down to Del Toro's unmistakable visual style. But mostly it's because this version understands that Hellboy isn't really about a demon. It's about belonging. It's about family. It's about choosing kindness when the world expects something else. And it's about proving that destiny isn't written in stone, even if your right hand literally is. More than 20 years later, Hellboy still stands as one of the most distinctive comic book movies ever made. It doesn't chase trends, it doesn't rely on endless spectacle, and it never apologizes for being wonderfully strange. It's funny, heartfelt, packed with memorable creature designs, and anchored by one of the most perfectly cast lead performances in superhero movie history. Sometimes all a movie needs is incredible practical effects, a director who genuinely loves monsters, and a giant red hero who's just trying to get through another day without accidentally ending the world. Alright, next time I'll wrap up our look back at the short-lived franchise with the 2008 sequel, The Golden Army. So if you're interested in checking that out, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. If you feel like having a look at my recent 3-part perspective on the films of Pauly Shore, starting with the 1992 classic Encino Man, you can find that right here. Or here's a playlist for all of the other personal favorites and cult classics I've shared my thoughts on.